What is the best greasing practice for doing any of our motors, whether we're looking at a pump motor, tower motor, chiller motor? How should we go about this greasing process? I personally use the specific volume method, but we'll talk about that. And it's not the only one, and that doesn't apply to absolutely everything. But I'm Holden Schamberger with Chiller Academy and HVAC Time. Let's talk about a chiller tech's perspective on approaching greasing and how we're going to go through the different practices. Now, there are a few methods to talk about, and there's three in particular I'm going to hone in on. I've used all three, and actually in this order of how I got to my current practice. So the first is just pump and go. That is quite literally, you're going to walk up, and you're going to put a few pumps in, whatever your preference is. You're not really going to worry about anything else. You're just going to go through, pump your grease, and move on. Not a whole lot of thought or time goes into it beyond that. I did that method for a number of years early on. And I will say that for smaller equipment, you'll probably get away with those types of methods for longer. As equipment scales and bearings get larger and we need more volumes, or we need to be more in tune on what's happening, that kind of falls apart pretty quickly. But I think it's where I see the pump and go used on the smaller scale probably the most. But anyway, the second is a drain and purge. So most or a lot of our bearings, especially on motors, the housing will have a drain plug on the bottom. We can pull that plug out, and in some cases you may get a little bit of some liquid type grease coming out. Lots of times you'll just pull that plug out, and the purge aspect is you're going to pump grease in until you get two ways actually, until there's either grease coming out in general. So as soon as you start to see grease come out, you stop, or you're going to continue purging until it looks like fresh grease. So grease that has been in there and it's been getting used, it will get this dark tint to it, and it'll look kind of burnt's not the right term, but it gets this dark coloration in with use. So that's going to be the first bit of grease coming out, and then you'll get your fresh grease starting to push out. Then you stop, you wipe off the excess, put the plug back in, you're done. And there are some manufacturers that actually that's the way that they want you to go about it. So just be aware of that, but that's not my preferred method. So I use that when it is specified, but most of the time it's not, in my experience from what I have seen. So that is a drain and purge method. That's what I'm going to call it. Then we have I'm just referring to as specific volume. And what I mean by that is every pump of your grease gun produces a certain amount of grease within a cubic inch. So one pump may be a quarter of a cube, of a cubic inch of grease. Okay, so that would mean 4 pumps is 1 full cubic inch, or 5 pumps, whatever is specific to your grease gun, and it's going to vary a little bit. So this is something to calculate. And the way that I was actually taught this was that this literally just take some cardboard or a piece of paper, make a 1 by 1 cube on the paper, cut it out, fold it up, and then just have consistent pumps like what you would do in the field, pushing into that little cube, and see how many pumps does your grease gun take to fill that whole cube up. Because a lot of bearings, they're rated on their greasing based off of run hours mainly. So for every, say, like 3,000 run hours or something to that degree, which most of the time is basically like if we grease it quarterly, we're going to be thereabouts. So for every X amount of hours, these bearings need X volume of grease to properly lubricate them. That's how a lot of bearings are actually rated, at least in the literatures that I've gone through. This is where it is important that if you have pumps, and I'm going to try not to derail too far here, but if you have pumps and such that are not running, they're not used, they're strictly lag, please don't grease those. Okay, if it doesn't have run hours and it hadn't actually used that grease, don't grease it. It doesn't need it. It's just been stationary. We should focus on and be careful to grease what actually comes online and gets used. So these are things we should think about and be aware of. Now, how do we know that as the technician? A lot of times you may not, but this is where getting familiar with that property, the account, the customer, how they do things, whatever. Do your best to just ask those questions and then try to familiarize yourself with what they are doing. So, greasing a non-used piece of equipment is no different than just over greasing in general, which is possible. Anyway, we're going to follow so within the set amount of time that bearing has been in operation, it should receive X amount of grease. And I find that there is a little bit of a scale that bearings will follow, so that, basically based off the horsepower. So this is not a perfect rule of thumb, but for the most part, most horsepowers will use a fairly similar size of bearing, and those bearings need fairly similar volumes of grease given their run hours. So I've kind of deduced it down to where if I'm within these ranges of horsepower and I'm not in like a specialty application where I need to be precise, then I know that I could probably use 2 pumps for this, 3 pumps for this, given my grease gun. Now, again, your grease gun is going to affect that. So I am very cautious to put too many parameters onto this, because I'd really rather you go out, look up some of this data, look up, was it WEG motors, you look up US motors, look up some of these, look up the brands you're actually seeing routinely. Like, what are your brands? Westinghouse, like, what are you seeing? Then look up that brand's motor and see what their spec sheet says, and then familiarize yourself with that and do what that says, right? And then base your grease gun off of that. Your grease gun may produce a different volume than mine, so I'm very, very careful to recommend to you this amount. Anyway, if you follow that, you can you'll stay within their specifications, and this may be true to even just the type of grease you use, but I'm honing in on just the practice here. Now, I don't pull the drain plug or anything to do this, okay? So that's one thing I will specify. And all of this is for non-sealed bearings. So if you're not familiar, a sealed bearing has sealed shields. So the shields are the plates that go in between the outer and inner race, the rings that the bearings spin inside of. Those are your races. And the shield is the piece of thin metal that is hiding the bearing to where you can't see it. Now, if it's sealed, that means that it has a very special grease by the manufacturer inside of it, and that grease is going to stay there. That motor should not be greased, and don't play with those shields. If it is if it's not sealed, which is the majority of our bearings, though, it'll have shields on it for protection, but they're not actually doing any other function for the most part. And so typically what that means is that in your bearing housing, the side of the bearing that faces away from the rotor and the stator, or that faces on the outward side, is maybe another way to say that in like a pump example. So if it's facing to the outer side, away from the center of the motor or the pump, that will typically be your bearing housing side, and that will not have a shield. The inner side will typically have its shield on there to help hold the grease. That's really its main function, is just grease retention. If you have blown shields, you're going to go through a lot more grease unnecessarily, because that shield is not there to help hold that grease and allow as much excess to sling out and make a mess everywhere. Anyway, it's important that we be careful of how much we're pushing in. We don't want to blow those shields out. Now, I personally don't pull my drain plugs unless I need to. Now, if I'm doing the purge method, okay, then obviously you have to. But If I'm just doing a standard greasing, I'm not going to pull the plug, but I don't need to, because I'm only putting in a certain amount in there. There's two methods to track this and analyze it. One is the actual heat of the bearing, which is one way to know. Okay, so if you've got like a thermal imager, or if you've got, which is my preferred way, or if you have just a temp gun, something along those lines, you can put it to or you can take a measurement of the bearing housing, and you can see how hot that housing is going to get. Now, bearings in their normal process, they're going to get hot. That's how they heat up the grease, liquefy it, and lubricate themselves. And there's this whole balancing effect happening. But a poorly greased bearing will run a higher temperature versus a properly greased one. So one of the signs that you've got enough grease in the system is when you're done, you take a step back, your temperatures will begin to fall on your bearing housing. Now, this takes a little bit of time because that new grease has to get in there, has to get warmed up. We've got to go through the whole process. But if you can take a before and after, you should see lower temperatures. And that's, say, if the bearing didn't have enough grease to begin with. It may be possible there was still enough grease in there to properly maintain the bearing, and you may not see that much of a temperature change, which is why my preferred method is vibration. Using a vibration sensor, you can actually see that if you have a bearing that has hit its run hours and needs some more grease, by taking that vibration reading, you'll actually see that once you get the proper amount in there, the vibration is going to settle out. And it may not be reading bad to begin with, but you'll notice just these subtle little dips, if you're graphing this, the graph will be a little less erratic with the bearing process, or with it running. That's because that grease got in there and helped smooth a little bit of that out. So those are some measurable ways to see was enough grease added, other than just going off of the specifications themselves. Now, my issue with the drain and purge method is I would consider that for most applications over greasing, and this is something you have to be careful with, in my opinion and experience. Okay, so I know a lot of you follow the purge and the drain and purge method, and you do what you're trained to do for your application. I'm not telling you you're wrong, but I am just expressing from my perspective. Most of the applications I've worked in, what you end up doing is you fill up the bearing housing with grease, and I don't think that's a good thing, because that grease creates a lot of thermal mass to take heat in. And what that means is that bearing long term has to run at higher temperatures in order to get that large volume of grease up to operating temp so that it can liquefy and get into the race assembly. And so because it's having to run so hot, it's not good to run elevated temps on our bearing assembly like that. We would rather keep that temperature down. So therein in itself lies my issue with that method, especially if that's not what this manufacturer specified. You run hotter temperatures, which puts more stress on your bearing assembly, which just hurts the overall process and shortens lifespan. Whereas if a lot of, like for my grease gun, a lot of smaller motors, we're talking less than 20 horse, it may only need 2 pumps every quarter. And it's something that small. It doesn't take a tremendous amount typically. But if you were to do a purge method, you may put 5-10 pumps. Well, maybe 10 may be a bit excessive. 5 to 8 pumps, something like that instead. For me, it comes back to just getting the right amount so that we have a balance on bearing temperature operation and how much grease is actually needed. Now, if greasing is not being kept up with at a property, then yeah, for sure, it's better to have too much grease, because then eventually that grease will get used and the volume inside of the bearing housing will begin to reduce. So at least at that point, they had some excess in there. But that we're talking this property is not properly maintained to begin with. That's an outlier. I'm talking about just in every day, we're doing a proper quarterly or whatever your specifications are on greasing practices. And that's why I stopped doing the drain and purge method, is because I felt that my bearings were running a lot hotter. And then the research I found on this shows that that's not the specified or recommended method lots of the time. We just need this certain amount of grease for this motor with this amount of run hours, which we can typically, like, we can genuinely get a rough assessment on what those hours would have been. It's not that complicated or big of a deal if we just understand what the general schedule is of the building, what their rotation schedule is. You'll have a general assessment of, okay, this motor should have, or this pump should have X amount of hours roughly, which means that it's time for a greasing and da 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 da. I do just want to reiterate, the drain and purge is the correct method at times. Okay, I'm not saying that that is wrong. What I do personally believe, though, is if that is not specifically specified, then I will do the specific volume as a means of maintaining a proper lubrication without having to force my bearing to run as hot as it is. So that's my balance I'm trying to strike there, and why I do it that way. And again, that's going to change heavily based off a lot of factors. So you really do just have to analyze that for yourself. But these are things that we should have a baseline understanding and knowledge of. Like, this is a core function as a technician. We need to understand this stuff. If we don't, then we're not educating ourselves to where we need to in order to properly just do our job. These are basics here. Okay. So if you haven't taken the time to research this, these are some things to research. Understanding bearings is a core fundamental piece of our mechanical function as chiller technicians, chiller mechanics. We need to know this. So you've got to go out there, develop your own practices, opinions, and principles, and just you move forward with what works for you, what your boss tells you to do, things of that nature. I'm just expressing the journey I've gone through to get to where I am and why I do what I do now. And I would love to know, what is your thoughts on this? What practice do you follow? Why do you follow it that way? Just what information do you have to bring to the conversation? I think it would really help a lot of people hearing the different perspectives and being able to engage in that conversation. I'd love to see that down into the comments, and let's flesh it out. I'm not 100% correct. Okay. This is not the gospel of what you need to follow. This is just a perspective to help you work towards what you feel is best for what you are doing and what you see on a daily basis. And I talk about a lot of this stuff in depth and in detail over at chilleracademy.com, specifically in the Introduction to Chillers course. Got a whole thing where I go through pump maintenance and greasing procedures, and I really detail this out over there. So if that's interesting to you, or if you'd like some help improving your worth and growing yourself as a chiller technician, go check out chilleracademy.com. Otherwise, MTT. Make the time for your family, for your spouse, for your kids. Really just do your best. Give them some time. It's a tough industry. Otherwise, keep up the good work. You're doing good. I'm going to see you around out there.